Welcome back to the channel. Last time we assessed the damage to our concrete pour from the monsoon that hit it, and today we're going to absolutely send it and hope for the best. So let's get into it. All right, we are back. We are ready to actually start getting all of the wood down. And today, what we're going to do is first pressure wash all of this off, get all the dirt. It's not as big of an issue there as it is here on the old wall where all the stuff has kind of flown down from all the rain we've had recently. We want to get as much of that out of the way as possible. We got to shovel out that corner that's really washed out. Then once that is clean and we have a good base layer, we know it should be all level from all the grinding we did. We are going to take these 6x6s. We're going to line up this whole first row, and then we are going to start drilling into it and getting that first row secure. That is the game plan for today. Get that first layer down, and then all the subsequent layers should go a lot faster. So let's break out the pressure washer and let's get going. Now, the surface didn't have to be perfectly clean because we're not bonding to it. We're not putting an adhesive or anything on it. It's mostly so I'm not kicking dust into my own eyes. And on this long stretch where all the sand washed out from the rain, I just want to actually be able to see that bottom surface because there's so much buildup there that it would actually cause the boards to not sit level. That's really the goal, is get rid of all the massive buildup sections and keep it from flying into my eyes all day. But by cleaning up the old section, we did uncover a few potential more issues. I stated in the excavation video that the entire back of this yard is filled with rock ledge, which is why they couldn't get it down to being perfectly level. So what you're seeing here is that that rock ledge comes up really close to the edge of this concrete slab, so in some sections it chipped out because it just flaked off, and in this other section the rock ledge is actually poking up above the concrete surface by a little bit over an inch, which means directly after cleaning this, I'm going to have to take out the angle grinder and cover both myself and the entirety of this walkway in granite dust. You can probably tell from my voice, I really don't want to do that. So before I go ahead and start, what I'm going to do is still lay down that first layer. We're going to find out if this is actually a problem, if it's really interfering with that first layer, and then if it is, we'll worry about it at that point. So let's go ahead and start dry fitting that first layer and figure out how screwed I am. Each of these 6x6 boards is roughly 60 to 80 pounds, so having the help of somebody else certainly makes this a lot easier. We went around and did a rough layout of this first layer, and we also ended up putting a few boards aside because they were a little bit too warped from sitting directly in the sun. And that's not to say that those boards won't be usable eventually on part of the wall, it's just that we don't want them on this first layer because we need that to be the flattest and we're going to build up from there. So something being off here on the first layer is going to compound the issue the farther up the wall that you go. And with the first row down, let's see if there's any other problems we can find. First row is in place, took the level and checked everything to make sure that everything was actually level down here, and therefore our wall is going to be straight across. So there's a couple local spots where it's maybe a 1/16 of an inch off over about 2.5 feet or so. But on the whole, some places look like they're this way, some places look like they're that way, which means we're pretty much straight when you take in the full length of this wall, and that most of our variation is just coming from the rough cut of the wood. Now, that section that I didn't do, that has a very, very slight gradient, but this section here, first of all, matches the gradient perfectly, which means I did something right for the second time in my life, which is also caught on video, and the height here, pretty much perfect. It's exactly where we wanted it to be. And the board above has pretty much no gap, and it just fits naturally, which is what we wanted. Now, we could cut this corner a little bit here, and that's what we're going to do to make sure that we seal that gap there. I'm thinking about leaving a little bit of a space for drainage. The only place that is an issue so far is coming over here. This is exactly the spot that we thought it was going to be, where that ledge is sticking up underneath. You can see it is clearly cantilevered, and you got almost an inch, not quite an 1.25 inch gap on that corner, which means I can do this. So we'll have to trim that down. That's kind of a bummer. I really didn't want to do that and spray myself with more rock dust today, but that is the nature of the beast. So let's get that done, and then once that's done and we're happy with this, we should be in a pretty good spot to start drilling things down. To take down the high spot, I used the same technique that I did on the concrete in the last video, where I did these plunge cuts, then used a hammer and chisel to try to chip out those little channels. What I figured out quickly was that this granite was substantially harder both to cut and to punch out than the concrete itself was, which doesn't really come as a surprise considering that granite is literally one of the hardest
hardest materials in the world, falling in second place to the diamond-coated bit that I was using to cut it. Now once I took down that really high spot, I tried to double check using that first piece of lumber again. There was a second high spot that was next to it that I honestly didn't even notice at first because this first spot was so bad. So I did have to go back and clean up that second spot as well, but after that had been addressed, we were pretty much good to go. Then I did my two favorite things, which are make sure it was level, and of course it was perfect now, followed by refueling and rehydrating because that seems to be what I do every 10 minutes when I'm working in the sun. But after sufficiently rehydrating, I was ready to go ahead and do the final cuts for this first row. Now I wanted to start off by making sure that row was actually straight so I was getting the right dimensions, especially on those end cuts. So before anything else, I set up a single taut string as a reference line. That way I knew this thing was actually straight and wasn't going to be shifting all over the place. The next step was starting to figure out the angles. Specifically on the first layer, there's a lot of things you have to think about in terms of layout, how the blocks are going to stack up, and what angles you'll have to be cutting at to make the faces line up nicely. And until you're actually at this point, these are things you either probably haven't thought about, or even if you have thought about them, quite frankly, anything that you've thought previously probably won't be valid once you're actually here setting up the blocks. You'll realize that when you're actually doing this, it doesn't line up how you thought it would in your head, so you have to make some improvisations. So as a result, this first layer is going to take a lot more time, and you're going to have to figure out a lot of these things as you go, because quite frankly, no amount of planning is going to get it done for you. A good example of this is trying to cut these blocks. The angle took a little bit of time to dial in, and even being off by 1 degree makes a very noticeable difference when you actually line up these things together. But the other issue is that these blocks, being 6-inch squares, were a lot thicker than my saw could cut in a single slice. Now some people have really deep circular saws and they can just eyeball this. I don't have that equipment, and quite frankly my circular saw skills are not that great. I also do not have the confidence to cut this with a chainsaw. So instead I made the first cut on one side, rolled the block of wood around, lined it up as best as I could by eye on the other side, and then just prayed that my cut lines lined up. Fortunately, I've got years of woodworking experience, so I got pretty freaking close doing it this method, but this was definitely an obstacle that I was not thinking about going into this. Another thing is that each section that we're putting up is 8 feet, but because this is the real world, the total distance that we're covering is not divisible by 8 feet, which means that we have our full blocks and then we have like a weird couple foot section on the end, and you have to think about where you want to put that so that 1, it doesn't look strange, and that 2, it's not going to structurally impact this. So for example, if I had a 1 or 2 foot cutoff section at one of these joint interfaces in the middle of this, that would make this joint where the angle changes a lot weaker than if I did that same block in a section that was straight. Retaining walls are all about distributing the force, and if you have these strange short blocks, it doesn't distribute them as well as a full run. Expect a lot of those little issues to pop up as you're doing the first layer, and plan for that first layer to take way longer than every other layer after it. I was expecting to probably spend close to the full day both cutting the full layer as well as securing it to the ground. I barely got it laid out and didn't start securing it at all, and it took the entire day. That said, this was huge progress. We solved a lot of issues, and we're finally getting a glimpse of what the end result's going to look like, and honestly, it's looking incredible. For the most part, everything's nice and straight, everything's sitting flat on that new foundation that we poured, and shockingly, the pieces are fitting together way better than I had imagined, which is honestly one of the best feelings there is when you're doing a project like this. The first layer is by far the most critical. Spend all the time that you need here because this is going to make the biggest difference over the entirety of the project. And with that, we've made some great progress today, so let's go to some real-time footage with a couple closing notes.
We got the first layer for the most part put into place. Now, one thing we didn't do is this last little end cut there. I didn't do it here. I didn't do it on the far corner. The reason being, when we start securing all these things down, we're going to do like our actual string line, make sure all the depths and stuff are correct. It's going to line up a little bit differently than it does now. So this might shift ever so slightly. So this length might change. So if we cut it now and that length is shorter than what it needs to be at the end, we got to recut the wood and then it's just wasteful. So instead, we're going to cut that bit later. That's not a huge deal. It's only like a foot or so. Our gaps are relatively close. That's looking pretty good. This whole line here we did do on the string. That's looking great. These gaps here are pretty consistent along the front. That's looking good. So it doesn't look like much, but this was actually a huge amount of progress. I'm really happy with the amount we got done today. That was like a lot of decision making and a lot of angles and double checking and trying to figure things out.
Today feels like the most progress that we have made on this retaining wall, and honestly, this has made me so much more motivated to go out and tackle the rest of this project. So that'll do it for this episode. I'm going to resume in the next morning when I am ready to fasten these to the ground and we can hopefully crank this out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.